down in a new month, it's time to look back and rank all 11 December 2024 movies. Hello and welcome to Cinema, where we focus on a film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema. Let me know down in the comments below how you would rank the movies you watched last month, and let me know all your takes of whether you thought it was a good month to end off 2024 or it was a mixed month. Let me know all that. Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it, subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. And getting in last place, we have Kraven the Hunter, possibly the worst comic book movie to come out of last year. It was comedical in the wrong ways, just the way they built up all these different antics, the way they set up all these action pieces. The CGI looked very not so good. So the way you get this star-studded cast, you get Russell Crowe, you get Aaron Taylor Johnson, who also starred in Nosferatu, which is much better than last month. Just the way they pull off all these strings, just take all these ways of going about its story, becoming uncompelling by the narrative that it builds up. You get an accurate looking Rhino character to finally insert into the Sony universe, but unfortunately all of it is a collaborated mess that feels contrived, that feels just messy by the storytelling, becomes uninteresting, and ultimately almost boring if it wasn't for all of the wrong ideas being put together, putting certain jokes that just don't always land well, and the way you take all these different characters, try and put them up, get this backstory to what we get out of Kraven, and then jump 18 years ahead once he gets his powers. You're missing the complete journey of his discovery of his powers, how he changes as a person over that time. So unfortunately, there's such a complete mess of not being able to understand the full concept of the story that's held at hand. Which goes into number 10, we have Y2K. Now this one wasn't particularly compelling to me. I thought there were some things that kind of worked. The party scene was the best part of it, but once you're getting out from there, you're focusing in on these characters that just don't always work effectively. The CGI or other things can look good. Certain elements can be natural to what you're building up from this, but unfortunately it has all the wrong story beats that builds these characters in an uncompelling manner, making them unlikable in some degree. And so the way you establish these characters, try and force random characters together, it feels very unnatural the way they get together and very forced by the way they pull them into certain situation, always getting them. You're not necessarily feeling the danger of the situation. So while it's an A24 film that I love the studio, I love the idea of the concept and premise for this film, just being what if Y2K came to life. Unfortunately, all of the wrong ideas were put together and took this off into something that just didn't land well by the end. And at number 9, we have Mufasa the Lion King, one I was hopeful for, just in the sense that I initially liked the original live-action Lion King. Upon rewatch, I didn't love it so much. But even with this one, it's taking its original sort of prequel concept, forcing you into the idea of how Mufasa came into reality, how all the friends came together that made up the cast of The Lion King. But unfortunately, there are so many elements that feel contrived. There's songs that just didn't work to the elements that the live action CGI just doesn't necessarily click to the lively emotions that you could have if it was more animated. And while I still enjoyed a nature documentary style to it in one retrospect, I do get the general idea it was going after. Unfortunately, the way they pull all of these ideas off, the journey feels generic. The way they establish these characters, they just so happen to find each other along the way, along Mufasa's journey. And so that's something that just doesn't really build upon its stakes. And even the beginning, once you're really establishing where everything is going, where Mufasa gets lost from his family, it just rushes you into the next scene, scene after scene, establishing different things things before you can get a grasp on what's actually going on Mufasa actually being lost from his family. And so that just leads you into different steps along the way, feeling like the villain to this story with the White Lions are relatively generic, and it's taking all of the safe routes possible that unfortunately I had more hope for than what was delivered. And at number 8, we have Mary, a biblical film on Netflix that unfortunately I didn't necessarily have high expectations for. But while certain things can work effectively, the story, the narrative, certain elements with Anthony Hopkins being Herod, there's taking liberties from the scriptural Bible that makes you wonder who it's necessarily meant to be for, because if it's already taking liberties off of the story it's based off of for religious beliefs, it's totally going to turn off that initial audience, and it's not necessarily something that non-religious people or non-Christians will get into and enjoy for the purpose of being an entertainment setting, because it's a completely different shift on who the premise is meant to be for, taking it in all sorts of weird sort of vibes, taking this own imagination where things don't line up with the characters. They almost idolize Mary for who she is. She's meant to be a chosen one type of character, and so it almost becomes in one sense a feminist type of movie. Yes, there's a strength in who Mary is as a person, who she was meant to be, chosen by God, but ultimately it unravels in a way that it just becomes less compelling, because taking its own liberties and its own beats, that doesn't ultimately pay off in the way that it really expects it to. And so unfortunately there's certain things that just unravel in a way that doesn't necessarily line up with the way it's obviously not taken heart to what it's basing off of. And when it's based on the Bible, that's really where it doesn't match up with anything that has a correct audience for. And at number 7, we have Lord of the Rings War of Rohirrim. Now, I was compelled just because it's Lord of the Rings. We're getting into anime. I'm not particularly an anime fan, or haven't explored that just as well, and so I thought this would be an opening introduction in some retrospect, and unfortunately it takes some of the more generic routes that you could take with this. It was fine to some general degree. It has some of the great battles, other things that pull about along the way, but some of the references to where it is headed as a story, as a whole, referencing Gandalf, referencing the battle and other things that go about, unfortunately, it's just not creating the right characters with the right story beats, with the right flow that, well, it can look good. It's naturally building upon some characters that have certain tropes that you can dig into. Unfortunately, it's not enough that offers enough flavor to change the pace, to change the aspects or religious elements that are bleeding into. Doesn't necessarily have any of the themes that you're looking into, that you're wanting from the original stories. So unfortunately, while they may be trying to force Lord of the Rings time and time again just because it's meant to be this franchise that everyone loves, you can't necessarily have the same ideas being able to pull it off in the same ways without creating that magic of the themes that it originally have, based on a writer that had all these preconceptual ideas that probably won't be able to be recreated in anything ever that someone tries to do for this franchise. Next up, we have a complete unknown coming from director James Mangold, who has done Wolverine, Logan. So whilst really anticipating what was to come out of this, introducing Timothée Chalamet and Edward Norton, Elle Fanning. So it's a great cast, and for me personally, I'm not a familiar fan of Bob Dylan, knowing who he was, all the things that go about. So I didn't necessarily know what the story would be like going into it. Maybe I was too anticipated for what was to come of it. It was good for the nature of what it was building up. It was informative. It's had some story beats that didn't naturally flow, which in one sense is good because it's more unique of a biopic taking different takes on where the story direction would go. But at the same time, while I love the performances, Timothée Chalamet was great at Bob Dylan. Edward Norton sort of as his apprentice in some degree. The way they built up certain elements along the way. Now there were some things where some characters didn't show up from time to time. They weren't part of his life for the whole thing. And there was somewhat of an odd structure starting in early 60s and then jumping about 4 years, jumping a couple little bits here and there along the way. And so that's where something didn't always line up with the timeline. They introduced something through the dialogue saying there's going to come over tonight. And so then it became the next day or some other time, which can throw off the balance to the flow of the story, things you're building up and introducing as a whole, which to some retrospect, it's not a typical narrative when it's based off a biopic, but it's not a documentary either where it's information feeding, to which, yes, there is some bias where, since I'm not necessarily a fan or familiar with Bob Dylan's story to begin with, it has to take its own ways. People that are a fan very likely would have loved this much more, but for me, being a new founder for who Bob Dylan is, it's good enough for the nature of what it establishes. The directing is good, the costumes, everything, the scenery and the settings as a whole is established, and so it's just enough for me to really enjoy what we got out of it, even if there's certain setbacks to my personal viewing experience that maybe coming down the road when I learn more about Bob Dylan, rewatch this as a whole, and knowing what to expect, it may be a better experience for what I get out of it later down the road. And at number 5, we have That Christmas, a nice, lovely, family fun Christmas film that's solid. It's somewhat generic with some of the story tropes here and there. The way they introduce or build up certain character tropes, other things that can be ridiculous because it's in animated form. You're going about some unrealistic flow of some things, a car flipping over, other things that the survival rate is strong, and so there's still a sense of endangerment at certain points, not knowing how people will get out of things. It's a Santa Claus story that isn't necessarily based around Santa Claus. He's only there for a little bit at the beginning. He's sort of telling the story, but it's a small town that's secluded, everything that builds about along the way, that has some really nice, touching family themes of community, of staying together, of helping each other. It's not a familiar culture for me personally. People around our town and everything, it's not necessarily going to be that close-knit, everyone helping each other, but at the same time, it delivers on the ideas, the format, everything that delivers about along the way. A nice style of animation that goes about these tongue-in-cheek sort of jokes here and there, the way there's a little bit of a romance between a young girl and boy. So just how that all works out as a whole is something that's making this one worth watching now and then again, even if it's not one you watch like every time for Christmas as a traditional. And at number 4, we have Sonic the Hedgehog 3, possibly one of my more surprising movies of 2024, just because I wasn't a huge fan of Sonic 1 and wasn't certainly a fan of Sonic 2 or Knuckles series. This one delivered, had all the right energy. There's certain elements that the comedy still doesn't work all the time, but at the same time, for me not being a huge Sonic game player, getting all the nostalgia, getting all the Easter eggs, understanding everything that could make it that much more eccentric as someone that is a fan of the games, plays them all the time, this is something that still delivers effectively as a story, what we get out of Knuckles, what we get out of Sonic and Tails, but most importantly, what we get out of Keanu Reeves adding in as Shadow and bringing back Jim Carrey once more, playing both the grandpa and the son of what we're getting out of Robotniks, how they're becoming the villains once more. Yes, it can feel somewhat repetitive in some nature, but at the same time, it still delivers on the energy, on the action, and especially building up, going about these more serious notes with what they're doing with the trauma, things we're doing with Shadow Story, some of it becoming familiar, but still well well handled for the nature of a family film especially, and leading on to the third act with this great epic space battle, these things between the golden side, golden shadow, and how you're facing on Robotnik again, giving a little bit of a villain arc that goes about in its own way, and also Sonic getting his own little arc of his own that becomes interesting and compelling, so that much more becoming something that I was not expecting to be getting out of the third entry. And at number 3 we have Carry On, a Netflix film that's rather good. It's elemental for the way it builds upon this close encounter place while also being wide open with the airport security. It's a hostage situation that I always enjoy. Taron Egerton is great. Jason Bateman, sort of as a villain. I wish he was sort of less of a presence throughout the whole movie. I feel he was revealed a little bit too far on, but at the same time, the way they go about the story has the sense of energy that it deserves, has the build up and the weight of building about its action that really delivers on the way that Jaime Collet Serra delivers as the director. So how they introduce all these characters, adding in the stakes, there's certain things that go about along the way that I can just enjoy, take for granted, things that don't always make sense. You're not seeing the master plan being put together by the villains that could have made it more believable. But at the same time, it's one that you can just turn your brain off, enjoy for the nature of what it's offering as a whole. And that's just what makes it higher up on this list for last month. At number 2, we have Baby Girl, a steamy erotic thriller coming from Helena Regine, starring Nicole Kidman, Harris Dickinson, and Antonia Banderas. The way they set up all this love triangle, this dynamic relationship with Nicole Kidman being the CEO, is putting her life on the line essentially with all that she's setting up, getting persuaded and manipulated. It's not something for the light of heart, someone that wants to see abuse or manipulation put into play, but that's what somewhat more effectively works to the story as a whole, the concept of the story and the way that it executes its premise. It's another A24 film that is fortunately better than what we got out of Y2K last month. The way they pull off all of this energy, the way they pull off the elements of the erotic thriller, the thrills certainly work to the eccentric ideas. There's something that doesn't always flow properly with certain scenes here and there. It can throw off the balance if certain scenes last too long, but at the same time, the pacing feels gradually is slow in the way that it makes sense to the way that you're building up this relationship. Harris Dickinson playing this character that's manipulating, that also takes time to build up that relationship with that CEO, and so that naturally builds up something that's gradually uncomfortable and makes sense with the timing that's all going on, with Nicole Kidman being just great within her performance, everything that's being pulled off, her bravery to be put in this position. And so that's just this complex relationship between this older woman, this younger man, that really sets up the scene to be something that's very complicated, especially when the CEO, Nicole Kidman, is already married to someone that works out just as well, and the chemistry that puts out on screen really effectively works for the position, the setting, everything that builds upon the character beats, the story beats as a whole. Which takes me into number 1. We got Nosferatu, coming from director Robert Eggers. It is no doubt that I was to enjoy this one. Coming in 4 for 4 with his filmography, I just absolutely love all his films, the bleak setting, particularly with this one as well. It's adapting from the 1979 adaptation of the story, and while I haven't gotten to see the older ones yet, it particularly feels like this is almost a noir film that really takes on the black and white to most of the fullest extent. The costumes, the settings, everything that it builds up, establishes as a whole, the slight shifting of the cameras, moving to show certain reveals, the build up to that Nosferatu vampire reveal is something that's haunting, and that's particularly thing that I have to say is just the haunting presence of what we get out of Bill Skarsgård playing the vampire and other things that come about along the way. Since I wasn't familiar with the story, haven't seen the previous two films, this was not a story I was expecting to flow out. I was expecting something along the lines of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which, yes, I've seen that film and I see some of the comparisons between them, but it also takes its own twist on what it's doing with romance, on deception, the lies, everything that's building upon these other character relationships. Nicholas Hoult, Lily Rose Depp is fantastic within the way that she gets sucked into the story and owns what is going on with her world. And so just getting sucked into this world is something I have to admit to be saying about this. It's not one you love because of the atmosphere, the setting, what's all going on at hand with the vampire taking over, everyone believing it's some sort of plague or virus going on with the deaths that are going on. But that ultimately leads to something that's just very immersive to the world that you're building yourself in. So that's just my ranking of all 11 December 2024 movies I saw ranked from my least favorite to my favorite. Let me know down in the comments below what movies you saw last month and how you would rank them yourself, and if you thought December or even 2024 as a whole was a good year for movies or not so good. I'll be having many other 2024 rankings coming here soon on this channel, so make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. So that's just all, and make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.